Exposure can sometimes be hard, and you might have seen how to expose a photo correctly with the exposure triangle. Now, if you're not familiar with the exposure triangle, don't worry. It's very, very simple. It's just the 3 different settings in your camera that allow you to expose an image correctly. And that is your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. So now let's start by saying that exposing for photos and exposing for videos is different. You might be wondering, why is that? Well, let me explain. When you take a photo, there are a couple of things you want to keep in mind with the exposure triangle. And that is the shutter speed, how fast you want that based on how much movement is in the image, how much background blur you want, or how shallow of a depth of field you want, and that would determine what your aperture is at. And then your ISO kind of just is as low as possible based on the other settings. Now with video, it's a little bit different because your shutter speed is determined by the frame rate you're shooting at. So that completely changes up how you expose the image correct. So say if you're shooting with 24 frames per second, then you're gonna want your shutter speed to be 1/48th of a second. And you might be wondering why, and well, here is why. You want to make sure that your shutter speed is always twice what your frame rate is, because that introduces the correct amount of motion blur and it looks natural to the human eye. Otherwise, you'll have too much motion blur if the shutter speed is too slow, or you'll have not enough if the shutter speed is too fast. So if you're filming at 60 frames per second, your shutter speed is gonna need to be at 1/120th of a second. This will allow you to have a good amount of motion blur in the video. Now, there are some exceptions here, and you can see that in some Hollywood movies for certain effects, but for the most part, keep it twice your frame rate. So that completely alters how you expose an image, because now you have a set shutter speed based on your frame rate. And your frame rate, well, that's determined on what you're filming. So most of us film 24 frames per second for a video like this. So now we're all stuck with either 1/148th or 1/150th of a second for a shutter speed. And that can make exposing kind of hard. Because say you want to have a nice blurry background, but now all of a sudden your shutter speed has to be really slow. Now that screws up how you think about exposing an image, because now you can't adjust the shutter speed to anything you'd like, really. Before we go any further, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our latest videos. Now it has to stay the same, and that means your ISO has to be more versatile, but your ISO can only go so low. So if you want to open up your aperture a lot of the times you can't unless you use an ND filter. And so this is where video exposure gets a little more complicated than photo exposure. An ND filter is basically sunglasses for a camera, and this allows you to open up your aperture really wide, even in sunny conditions, even when your shutter speed is 1/148th of a second or something around there. What it does is it just blocks out some of the light. So this is an ND filter. As I said, basically sunglasses for a camera. And this is something special called a variable ND filter, this particular one, where if you twist the ring, it can get darker or it can get lighter. So I'm going to suggest you stick with a regular ND filter and not a variable, because you can sometimes see darker spots and lighter spots with the variable ones, unless they're really, really high quality, but then it gets really, really expensive and you're probably not watching this video. So let's recap here for video exposure. You still have your 3 basic exposure parts in the exposure triangle: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. But the difference between photo and video is in video, your shutter speed is always the same, and that depends on your frame rate you're using. Which means if you're in a sunny situation, your ISO has to be down all the way, which is good, but that means oftentimes you can't open up your aperture as wide as you would like, which means you're going to have to introduce an ND filter or reduce the amount of light in the scene, which can be very hard if you're outside, and oftentimes impossible. So NDs are a really good way to get a wide aperture in an outdoor setting in video when using the exposure. So in video, where did I stop? Then your shutter speed is going to be, you're going to want, Now there are some exceptions here with that you're used to with the next or it,